Hello, and welcome back to the Carbon Capture Magazine podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Piekarski, and today's guest is Assaad Mohanna, partner at ERM. Welcome to the podcast, Assaad.
Thanks, Danielle. Glad to be with you.
Yes, thank you for joining us. We're so happy to have you. So, Assaad, we usually like to start things off by having you tell us a bit about yourself and ERM.
Sure. Well, I'll start with ERM. ERM is a sustainability consultancy. It's based out of London with a very large presence in North America. I joined ERM in August this year after spending my first chapter in my career with oilfield service and equipment company, NOV. I spent time between Dubai, a little bit of time in Edmonton, Alberta, then back to Saudi Arabia for a few years before moving to the US in 2014. Most of my work was around well construction and drilling equipment until I got my MBA and shifted a little bit closer to strategy. My focus in the last few years has been on low carbon solutions. I was the senior director of low carbon solutions at NOV, and right now at ERM, my focus is building a carbon capture, use and sequestration practice here in North America, which is what we're going to talk about.
Very, very cool. So in terms of policy and permitting, what do organizations need to consider to facilitate the deployment of carbon capture, utilization, and storage?
Yeah, I think you're hitting on two critical aspects of CCUS. I'd like to kind of, as an intro, say that CCUS in the United States and North America in general is evolving very rapidly, and when we're advising clients on things like strategy and project delivery and investment, we come across some common themes and trends, and we're able to see sort of what are the most critical aspects that are holding investors and carbon capture as a service companies up at night. And so to your question, policy and permitting are perhaps the top two on people's minds. I think on the policy side, organizations got some relief with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act not too long ago. I think that's changed the landscape and it made a lot more projects actually economical. Some studies show that an estimated 800 facilities are now within reach under the IRA bill. On the permitting side, it is important for companies to know that permitting is perhaps the biggest bottleneck. It's not long lead items. It's not the availability of drilling rigs, although that's becoming an issue as well. But it's permitting, and that's holding things from evolving fast enough.
Right, and I would imagine that permitting looks different depending on where you're at in the country. What are some of the challenges surrounding permitting in different states or regions that may have different regulations?
Yeah, sure. Let me just clarify that when we say permitting in CCUS, the first thing what we're really talking about is Class 6 permits for the type of wells under UIC in which you're injecting the CO2. That's the type of permit that we're going after, and the requirements geographically may vary a little bit depending on who is the regulating agency you're dealing with. In most of the states today in the United States, it is the Environmental Protection Agency that manages Class 6 permitting, except for North Dakota and Wyoming, where it is the actual states that have primacy, meaning it's the states themselves, not the federal government, who's regulating the permits. That means that they have a bit more flexibility in placing resources and perhaps getting faster permits as opposed to EPA-regulated territories, which is the rest of the United States. Having said that, Louisiana is on the way of applying or getting, they've applied, of getting their primacy. Texas is next in line. Mississippi perhaps as well. California is set to be in that process as well. So there's multiple states trying to get their own permits. I think what's critical here is building relationships with these regulatory agencies and understanding what their requirements are.
Okay, so stepping away from the primacy and more to the geological side of sequestration, we know that certain sites must meet a geological criteria if CO2 is to be injected there. How does finding the formations for sequestration make a project more complex?
That's exactly right. That's what permitting is all about. It's finding that the right geologic formation, or proving sufficient evidence and data that wherever you're injecting that CO2 is going to remain in place. And so why it is very complex, to your point, is because Class 6 permitting is looking for three things. One is your injectivity, and to that, you're going to get your 2D or 3D seismics. You're going to get your porosity and permeability of the formation. And this is stuff oil and gas is very, very familiar with. But also, you're going to have to explore your overall mineral composition in the reservoir. When you inject CO2 in reservoirs, some dissolution precipitation reaction could take place, generating byproduct from the CO2. And so you want to be very careful what's happening there, particularly in how it influences or impacts underground water, drinking water sources. Number two is the capacity, your actual pore space. And that's where subsurface evaluation, available pore space, true quantification through modeling and seismic is critical. And really to get to a point where you know what your anticipated volumes of CO2 to be sequestered can be. Imagine, size of a tank, so to speak. And the third point is containment, understanding different penetrations in the site. I think that's the most critical part. If you have wells already drilled in the site you're trying to inject CO2 in, that's going to happen a lot in depleted reservoirs. The number of locations of various faults and stage of activity, you don't want to induce unintended seismicity in the region. And so because of these things, site selection is probably the most critical and makes this process complex and takes quite a bit of time.
Absolutely. So I know that you're familiar with offshore CCUS as well. What is some of the main differences between onshore and offshore CCUS and the challenges that we see?
For one, stakeholder engagement is not an issue. And that's one thing we haven't touched on is the population that's surrounding your injection site. And so imagine you're injecting in a vicinity of a town or where farmers potentially are operating, which is a real case happening in Louisiana in the lake. And so there's a big piece of public perception around CCUS that needs to be addressed onshore with the people around, a big piece of awareness and education on what CCS is and some level of community benefit plan for these big projects to support these communities. Offshore, that's not an issue, obviously, but also offshore differs in data availability. I think that's perhaps the more critical piece. While the chances of having seismic data on an onshore sequestration site are greater than what you would expect in finding offshore because it's much, much vaster. That's the second one. And the third, I think, is just the fact that the big piece of Class 6 permitting is around the protection of underground sources of drinking water. That's not an issue offshore because the Clean Water Act does not necessarily apply offshore like it does onshore. So it varies. I think the one critical piece for offshore today specifically is that the regulating agency for offshore is not clear. It's supposed to be EPA, but EPA handed it over to BOEM, but BOEM is revising. So there's quite a few moving parts offshore that people are anticipating before actual sequestration can happen.
Oh, that's very interesting. I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to go back to your first part of the question about public engagement in projects, which is essential to protecting and advancing communities as well as mitigating misinformation. What actions do you recommend taking when considering the education of the public in CCUS projects?
Yeah, I think stakeholder engagement is a giant piece of the puzzle. And for those not familiar with what stakeholder engagement is, it's involving the communities around a project so that you get favorable public opinion to move the project forward. You can have all the permits in the world, you can have all the financial support needed and all the technology available. But if there's a community on land that you're trying to sequester in that's protesting against your project, that's not going to move forward. It's going to delay you tremendously. And so engaging with those communities at an early stage, hearing it from you rather than from the news, engaging with the regulatory agencies and having conversations with them on their actual requirements. This is an iterative approach. I don't think anybody's defined what good enough looks like, not on the permitting side, not on the stakeholder engagement side. This is fairly new territory. And so being very cautious there, if you're following the news, you've probably seen that some projects have been actually stopped because of poor public engagement practices. Mm-hmm. And we're talking billion-dollar projects. So, engage with agencies, engage with local communities, the occupants of the area of review, even education with the schools, the utilities, fishermen and lakes is the case that's happened in Louisiana that people are keeping an eye on. But in apps, sometimes seen as more of a secondary step in what we're used to in oil and gas. Companies did not expect to see stakeholder engagement resistance in oil gas friendly territories like the Gulf of Mexico, or the Gulf Coast. But it's turning out to be a serious consideration to be taken. And I think it needs to be in high consideration for anybody thinking of a CCS project.
Absolutely. So other than that, what challenges will developers need to overcome to bring CCUS to scale?
Scaling from pilot to commercial is a real concern. What we're seeing is, obviously we talked about permitting and geology. The bigger your area of review, the bigger your permitting space, the more faults you're going to get into your subsurface. You're going to get into more complexities and unevenness of your storage reservoir. The CO2 plume migration becomes a little bit more constrained, but since you're injecting more CO2, your risk of mixing with potentially other CCS projects or other formations or further out penetrations or wells. So that's a real challenge for scaling. Obviously, with wider, bigger projects, there are always going to be more stakeholders, more people to say no, more people to engage with, and so that makes things a bit more complicated. But also, I think the one that we haven't talked about yet is how do you get more emitters to sign up, and that's been a real challenge out there. A big chunk of applicable emission points almost being hesitant to sort of join in and be part of CCS projects, mainly due to sort of a let's wait and see what happens now that the IRAs come in. Maybe there's a bigger carrot, or there's more uncertainty in changing policy landscape. And so while emitters want to reduce their emissions, there is a sense of misalignment in an incentive between the capture and storage companies and emission companies. And so it's a moving space, but definitely one of the things that we expect to see in 2023 and perhaps the next 2 or 3 years.
Great. Well, that was actually the last question that I had for you.
Good.
Did you have anything else that you would like to add?
Look, I think CCS is a tremendously exciting space. It is one of multiple decarbonization technologies or ways, but very highly promising. There's a ton of opportunity to, I want to say, add additional revenue streams with what the IRA offers to monetize these opportunities. If you have anything to do with oil and gas, you probably have something to do with carbon capture, use, and sequestration. And it's a great way to transfer those skills that you have and kind of create parallel operations to what you're doing. We're excited to be in this space and look forward to having more conversations like this.
For sure. Again, we are joined by Assaad Mohanna with ERM. Thank you again for joining me today.
Thanks, Danielle. This was fun.
Yes, and thank you to our listeners. If you or your company is interested in recording a podcast with Carbon Capture Magazine, please reach out, and we look forward to next time.